Welcome to another episode of the Clean Palette Podcast. I'm your host, Justice Johnson. Today, we peel back the paint and reveal the clean palette on the art movement known as Art Deco. As we moved into 2021, I figured that we would cover this movement because it took place about a century ago. This movement is very recognizable and holds so much impact for a movement that took place for only 2 decades and then faded out of culture very quietly. The era of Art Deco spans from the early 1920s to the late 1930s, and the term was not coined until 1965. The Art Deco Society of New York states that historians have not come together collectively for a definitive definition for the term. From what I have gathered, Art Deco starts right after the First World War. The term comes from a 1925 Paris exposition of a similar name. It started out in France, but many people know of its influence in 1920s New York. This was at the heart of what is called the Machine Age. The Machine Age spans from right at the start of World War I through the end of World War II. The Machine Age brought about the assembly line in 1913 and innovations to steel-framed buildings that allowed for much taller structures. The industrial era was based in consumerism. Production was at an all-time high, and more products could be made with new methods and technologies. After the war, it was a time of innovation and prosperity. Art Deco had so much to pull from for inspiration for the art. You had radio coming into play in the homes of many for the very first time. You had the jazz scene in full swing, and you had high-rises and skyscrapers. All things that were unimaginable before this time. This was the future. All of these technologies and methods held a luxury within its design. This kind of soaks into the aesthetic of Art Deco, and Art Deco and its aesthetic are where it gets hazy, because there are so many different aspects to the style. You have your canvas paintings, but that is only one fraction of what Art Deco is. Art Deco is way more than that. Art Deco held influence in some of the most memorable buildings known to date. It also had a very special type of interior design. Something that all three share is its geometric design. These elements are taken from Cubism, a style known for its angular features. Art Deco's angular designs and patterns were taken from African tribal designs, and the structures that were formed were influenced from early Mesoamerica and Egypt. The human body in these paintings would appear less smooth and would have sharper edges, but not necessarily pointy edges, like full abstract, like a Picasso. Some figures would take inspiration from various Asian styles, and these would allow them to become more flat. Others would have a more three-dimensional feel and would have deeper shadows, even more so than a realistic painting. But what both shared in common was that they had loud and bold colors, but also the subjects in these paintings, typically people, would be shown in a luxurious fashion. Many of these paintings were made using oil paint, and within these paintings there was an upper-class elegance to them. Depictions of luxury cars and fancy martini glasses would be displayed within the paints. Imagine the aesthetic for a second of the movie The Great Gatsby. That movie, in my opinion, completely encapsulates the feeling of Art Deco. This was the good life, the American dream, as many people were immigrating into New York, and this time frame would allow for more people to get that good life feel, at an affordable price. That idea of holding big parties requiring tuxedos, flapper-esque dresses, fancy martini glasses, and top-down streamlined cars. All of these things were no longer a fantasy. Items could have a similar look at half the cost. A great example of this would be silverware. Utensils did not actually have to be made of 100% silver. Cheaper metals could be infused within the product, but there would still be a mirror-like quality to them. Interior design would be impacted in this era as well. Many pieces of technology would resemble the industrial style at the time. Plastic and other inexpensive materials were made available for these products. This made the products very easy to afford, but they would also add chrome plating to them so they would have the fancy feel. Now people would have these new luxury items at a normal cost. Many household appliances would have a more industrial feel or a more luxurious feel. If you think of Nuketown in Call of Duty Black Ops 2, or if you think of there are many ways that you can imagine the luxurious feel and retro feel that Art Deco was made to have. Many items would have like great looking features because it still was the Industrial Revolution and the machine age. So if you think about your old school radios, those would have more graded features and would look as if it was coming out of, or it was a part of the factory. These would have a silver color to them as well to still give them that luxurious feel. But this also rang true for many aspects of your home. You could have cheap floors that, with newer technology, could be made to look more expensive or as nice as the more expensive ones. Many of the patterns within the homes were impacted by African tribal patterns, which we discussed earlier. These would now come into play. Some of the reoccurring patterns would be triangular shapes, trapezoidal shapes, a sunset and sunrise motif with still that very geometric design, a half circle, many triangles, maybe an arch. You would have nice floral patterns now and zigzags. A great example of Art Deco interior is the Fisher Building in Detroit or the Radio City Music Hall in New York. Many of these designs also show great symmetry. Terracotta was something that was also used within the buildings and is a very large staple of the interiors of the time. Terracotta, when translated, means blunt earth. This is ceramic that was used to mimic stone and other features, and you would have these sculptures, but they were more resembling flat figures at the time because a lot of the dimensional aspects were more flat. And so you would have these almost painting-like structures within using terracotta, but these classy elements were now added into the interiors of larger buildings in New York, but it was also used within the developments of the skylines of these developing cities. This kind of leads me to one of my favorite parts of Art Deco, and that is the architecture of the time, mainly the skyscrapers. As cities were becoming more inhabited, there was no place for more buildings, and so they only had one option, and that was to go up. Developments allowed for the steel framing, and with the steel frames came something called curtain walls. These walls could either rest on or be suspended from the steel frame rather than resting on load-bearing walls. Now, buildings could grow much higher than before without the risk of caving inward. Architects in the Art Deco era used very bold rectangular patterns for these buildings, stacking on top of each other, much like those Mesoamerican buildings of the past. They drew the inspirations from the pyramids in Egypt, but also the structures from Aztec and Mayan societies. One building that most of you will know, even if you are not familiar or say that you are not familiar with Art Deco or the Art Deco era, is the Empire State Building. The construction began in 1930 and was finished in a record-breaking time of 20 months. This structure is 102 stories tall and features the angular nature of the time. Very boxy, stacked on top of each other, and towards the top you get your half circle, you get triangles within the layers. But the symmetry of the building is one of the reasons why it is so recognizable. Many of the buildings within the same vein of the Empire State Building share similar features. Art Deco can be seen in almost every country that has a skyscraper, or at least its influences. In the late 1930s, the style seemed to just fade out, and one of the biggest factors of this was that the Second World War began in 1939, and with the war starting, things needed to become more practical. No longer was your design about elegance and class and luxury. It was now about practicality. So essentially, this was 100 years ago. So where does that leave us today? When it comes to pop culture, there have been many instances that you may not have even thought of previously. As we stated before, you have your Great Gatsby, but you also have movies such as Midnight in Paris and Bugsby Malone. Set within the Roaring 20s, all of these movies will take place. You will also have this feel of luxury and sleek design within these films. Some examples that you may not think of, but they kind of fall within the futuristic side when I think of Art Deco, would be the movie The Rocketeer. There are certain elements from the animated Batman series, and in my opinion, the old Nickelodeon show My Life as a Teenage Robot fits that industrial style, futuristic, streamlined feel. All of the characters' heads are very angular or boxed out, which you could say of many cartoons, but the whole idea where almost every building is this like chrome style. Jenny, the main character, is all chrome. That show, in my opinion, is heavily influenced by what Art Deco would have strived towards if the Second World War wouldn't have occurred. And many people now think that we might be kind of coming on to a second wave of Art Deco, or that it could potentially make a resurgence in the near future. While there is no world war, let's knock on wood, that would be going on right now, there has been a long reign of uncertainty. We have also seen the development of new technology over the last few years, such as self-driving cars. You have Tesla to be one of the most streamlined cars right now that is a luxury product. You have each phone that comes out being more sleek and more streamlined every time. And all of these are just so popular, and they're all innovations that have taken place within the last few years. These can all bump us back into the feel and spirit of Art Deco if there's a way to make all of these cheaper. These sleek designs in automotive, yet there are new homes that are more minimalist and angular. The future could be looming again, and so could another Art Deco movement. Would you like to see another Art Deco movement? Let me know. I'm always available on my Instagram, well, at least the Instagram for the show, at Clean Palette Podcast, which now that I am officially on Apple Music, they took a really long time to upload the podcast on there. So I haven't posted anything on the Instagram. I didn't want to leave out anybody that could potentially be a part of the group. add me on Clean Palette Podcast on Instagram and Twitter. I will be making sure that I post. Or you can follow my personal art page at Justice Tries. And if you are one of the lucky people watching this on YouTube, which is going to be on my art page, just in kind of a subsector, it is it's going to be Justice Tries. You can maybe snag yourself one of these nifty Clean Palette sweatshirts that I'm wearing right now. They're also in hoodies and t-shirts on justicetries.com in the store. But, thank you all so much for listening to another episode. I appreciate all of you creatives listening, maybe even the historians listening. But until next week, stay creative.